My grandson looked me in the eye that morning, his tone colder than the silver spoon he stirred his coffee with, and told me to sell the company his grandfather and I built from nothing. He said he wanted the money now, not later, not after I was gone. It was the kind of moment that splits a life in two before and after. Before that conversation, I believed that love could outlast greed. After, I was not so sure. Before I tell you how everything fell apart, I just hope anyone listening remembers that wealth does not ruin a family, entitlement does. It grows quietly in the corners of comfort until one day, it demands the keys to everything you worked for. The company had been my husband Walter's dream long before it became a name anyone recognized. We started it in our garage in 1976, when our marriage was young and the economy was not kind to dreamers. We made wood furniture by hand, carved from maple we bought with borrowed cash. I sanded, stained, and delivered orders in our old Ford pickup, often with Walter beside me and our baby asleep in the back seat. When people talk about legacy, that is what I think of, not the buildings or the profits, but the nights we stayed up, too tired to stand, too hopeful to stop. Over the years, the business grew beyond our hands. By the 1990s, it had warehouses, retail partners, and a staff that felt like family. Walter passed before he could see how big it became. I ran it afterward, slower perhaps, but with purpose. I thought keeping it alive was a way of keeping him alive too. Then came my grandson, Andrew. He was charming, confident, educated, all the things we had once wished we could afford to be. When he joined the company, I thought it was a blessing. I thought the third generation would carry our story forward. He called me Nana with affection, brought me tea during board meetings, and spoke about innovation and global markets. But beneath the smile there was calculation. I did not see it until it was too late. He began by changing things, the company's mission, the branding, even the way employees addressed each other. Professionalism, he called it. I called it erasing the soul. Still, I let him lead. I wanted him to feel trusted. I told myself that every generation must modernize the old. I ignored the way he rolled his eyes when I spoke about our founding values, or how he spoke to accountants like soldiers awaiting orders. The first true fracture came when he pushed to sell the factory land. Prime real estate, he said, as if heritage could be measured per square foot. I refused. He argued. The board leaned toward him, not me. I was their history, but he was their future. It was a quiet kind of betrayal, the kind that wears a tie and smiles while it happens. That morning, when he told me to sell the company and hand him cash, I did not argue. I simply asked him why. He said it was time to extract value. Words that sounded like something learned in business school, not at a family dinner table. I felt something tighten in my chest, not from age but from realization. He did not love the company or even the family that built it. He loved the power it represented. I did not cry that day. I waited until he left, until I was alone in my office surrounded by old photographs, the scent of cedar still faint in the air. My reflection in the glass cabinet looked smaller than I remembered, but my resolve was clearer than ever. I thought of Walter, of the first table we ever sold, of the promise we made, that our work would mean something, that it would stand for honesty and endurance. I realized then that I could not let our story end in a balance sheet, so I made a decision. I would not sell the company. I would not hand him a dime. But I also would not fight him the way he expected. A war over wealth destroys everyone. No, I needed something quieter, smarter. That night, I went home and opened Walter's old ledger, the one filled with handwritten notes and customer orders. I remembered something he once said, that true wealth is not in what you keep but in what you leave behind. And so, as the moonlight spilled across the pages, I began to plan. It was a plan that would change everything. The first step was to remember who the company belonged to in spirit. It had never been built for private yachts or vacation compounds. It had been built to put dinner on the tables of the people who lifted planks and pushed sanders and stacked shipments under Midwestern winters. So I called the attorney who had handled Walter's will, and asked to revisit what we had left undecided. I told him I wanted a structure that would outlast me, outlast fashion, and outlast the hunger that turns kin into opponents. He asked whether I intended a trust. I said I intended a promise made legally unbreakable. Paper alone would not save anything. I walked the factory floor for a week, not as a sentimental tour, but as a quiet audit of where value truly lived. I watched Lucille coax a sheen out of stubborn maple with the patience of a musician. I stood near the loading dock as Carlos counted inventory in his head faster than the scanner could beep. I felt the warmth of the break room microwave and the draft that whistled through the east door that no one had bothered to fix since the rebranding. I understood then that my defense would not be anger. It would be information, gathered carefully and used at the precise hour. A foundation emerged on paper before it had a name in my mouth. Its purpose would be to hold the golden share, a fraction of ownership with the weight of a gavel. It would carry a charter that required the company to remain independent, unless a supermajority of employees voted otherwise. Dividends would continue, bonuses would continue, and growth would not be strangled for the sake of purity. But any sale for the purpose of cashing out a single heir would be impossible. I did not hate my grandson. I hated the idea that he believed he could empty the house while the lights were still on. Every plan needs a hinge, and mine was a small bylaw amendment that most would overlook. It stated that legacy intent, as defined by the founding documents, had precedence over liquidity preference. It sounded dry. It sounded harmless. It would be the quiet spine of everything that followed. The board had grown accustomed to Andrew's words about momentum and aggressive timelines. They had grown unaccustomed to reading the footnotes. I did not expect to outtalk him. I expected to outlast him. Doubt visited at 3 a.m, faithful as an old neighbor. I lay awake and wondered whether I was being cruel, whether I was robbing a young man of his chance to steer. I thought of the memory that mattered most to me, a winter evening when Walter and I could not afford the last truck payment. He took off his wedding band and held it like a coin, weighing a sacrifice. I told him we would find a way without pawning promises. We did because we trusted each other. The ache that kept me awake was not about money. It was about trust that had been treated like a tool instead of a bond. More than sentiment pushed me forward. Numbers did. A quiet review with our controller showed a pattern I did not like. Consulting fees had flowed to a boutique firm run by Andrew's friends, and pilot projects had been rushed through without clear ROI. The amounts were not criminal, but they were careless. The company could absorb them. The culture could not. I wrote notes in the margins the way I did when Walter and I priced dining sets from lumber cost up instead of market price down. I wanted the story to be clean when I told it, not because I desired moral superiority, but because clarity is a mercy. Momentum gathered in small acts. I restored the apprenticeship program that had once paired high school seniors with master carpenters. I scheduled listening sessions without slogans, and I asked each team lead to write down what would make them proud in 10 years. Their answers were not about stock options. They were about sturdiness, family schedules, breathable air in the shop, and a brand that would not pretend to be coastal chic when it was born in a town of brick and frost. I felt younger reading them, not in body but in purpose. Resistance, of course, arrived dressed in confidence. Andrew announced an investor roadshow before the quarter ended. He circulated a deck with glossy wood grains and international ambitions. He did not mention that the proposed deal terms included debt that would sit like a backpack on the shoulders of people who could not afford to leave early when their kids were sick. He told the board that velocity was value, and that delays signaled weakness to the market. He did not say that patience could be strength. He did not say that care could be strategy. I was not loud. I was precise. I called a special meeting and declared it a legacy review. I brought the old ledger and placed it on the table not as a relic, but as a ledger, line after line of promises kept. I presented the foundation documents, the bylaw amendment, and the financial analysis of the investor term sheet, right down to what it would do to our winter cash flow when orders dipped after the holidays. I described how the golden share would function, how employee votes would be counted, how succession could be gradual, and how innovation could be incentivized without auctioning the soul of the place. I did not invoke nostalgia. I invoked stewardship. Faces changed as numbers replaced adjectives. The head of operations, who had watched 3 recessions without losing a crew, leaned forward. The retail partner liaison, who had been told by Andrew that tradition was a drag on margins, tapped a pen and asked about long-term supplier commitments. The board's attorney, who had missed 2 of the last 4 meetings because he assumed the outcome in advance, read the amendment twice and then a third time. The room did not tilt in my favor because I was older. It tilted because the case was stronger. Pride tempted me then, but I refused it. I reminded myself that the point was not to win. The point was to prevent a loss that would echo. I told them, in the steady way you speak at night when a storm rattles the windows, that this company had survived inflation cycles, material shortages, and the death of its founder. It could survive a momentary fever for quick capital. It could even survive my mistakes, which I listed plainly, including the year I overbought walnut, and the season I allowed a marketing trend to repaint honest wood in fashionable gray. People listened because they recognized the tone of a person telling the unvarnished truth. Silence followed, then a motion to table the roadshow until after an independent review of the proposed debt. The motion carried. Another motion proposed adopting the bylaw amendment subject to council's final review. That one passed by a single vote. I felt my hands steady against the table, the way they used to steady a plank before the first cut. Andrew watched me without blinking. There was no triumph in me. There was a grief that had not yet chosen where to live. The next days were restless. Rumors ran through the hallways like drafts. I walked through them kindly and kept working. The foundation charter was finalized. The employee council held its first formal gathering since the pandemic, not as a protest, but as a trunk of shared roots. The independent review arrived with a conclusion that would have sounded dry to anyone else but felt like a bell in my chest. The deal would stress margins, erode resilience, and obligate cost cuts that would land hardest on the people least responsible for risk. In other words, it would pay out the impatient and punish the patient. A final board meeting was set for a Tuesday afternoon under rain. I decided then that I would not ambush my grandson or shame him. I would offer him a path that honored his energy without granting him the keys to a fire sale. I drafted a transition plan for him to oversee the e-commerce division with true authority, a fair budget, and clear metrics. I paired it with the foundation's non-negotiable guardrails. He could build. He could not bulldoze. If he accepted, he would earn legacy from the inside out. If he refused, the company would continue without him, shoulders squared, future intact. The folders were arranged, the legal signatures were lined, the votes were counted. My heart felt older and freer. The rain moved across the windows in braided streams as the board members took their seats. I understood, in that gray light, that families do not only pass down assets. They pass down standards. The gavel touched wood. Rain fell harder by the time the meeting began. It softened the sound of footsteps in the hallway, as if even the sky wanted to keep this moment quiet. I watched the board take their seats, papers whispering, screens lighting up, pens poised. Andrew arrived last, crisp and confident, as though nothing had changed. He did not glance my way, but the air between us had the weight of everything unspoken. I had rehearsed what I would say, not to win approval, but to leave no room for confusion. I told them that a company built by hand could not be reduced to numbers alone, that its worth was measured not in what it could fetch in a sale, but in what it stood for when no one was looking. Then I opened the folder containing the final documents, the foundation charter, the transition plan, and the formal transfer of ownership rights into the legacy trust. The words had been reviewed by attorneys and accountants, but the intention was older than any of them. It was Walter's voice carried through my hands. When I finished, the room was still. The lawyer cleared his throat and confirmed the legality of the arrangement. Every clause, every amendment, every share allocation had been filed, verified, and sealed. The company could never again be sold without the consent of its people. It would outlive greed. It would outlive me. Andrew's jaw tightened. He did not speak for a long moment, only stared at the documents as though they were a betrayal carved into paper. Then he stood, collected his notes, and left the room without a word. The sound of the door closing was final, but not cruel. It was the sound of a future choosing its own door. I felt no victory in that silence, only a deep aching peace. The others remained seated, perhaps unsure whether to congratulate me or mourn with me. I told them simply that the company's next chapter would be theirs to write, and that my time as its steward was over. I would step back as chairwoman, remaining only as guardian of the foundation for as long as my health allowed. There was no applause. There was only a collective exhale, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. That evening I drove home slowly, passing the streets where Walter and I had once delivered tables and cabinets in our pickup. The city had changed, newer signs, newer faces, but the smell of sawdust still drifted faintly from the industrial park. It felt like memory refusing to fade. I parked by the old oak tree near the river, the same one we used to rest beneath when work ran late. The rain had stopped. I sat there letting the quiet fill me, and for the first time in years, I felt something like freedom. In the weeks that followed, the tension in the family did not vanish. Andrew did not call. He declined the position I had offered in the e-commerce division, and instead started a consulting firm of his own. I heard through others that he was doing well, ambitious, expanding, respected in his field. I wished him no harm. I only wished he had seen that wealth created without conscience eventually becomes a burden. The company, meanwhile, began to breathe differently. Employees spoke with more confidence. Departments collaborated without the shadow of constant restructuring. There was a new vitality in the air, not flashy but steady. I attended meetings as a quiet observer, not a decision-maker. The younger managers brought ideas that surprised me, but their decisions were grounded in respect for where everything had begun. It was enough. Months later, I received a letter from Andrew. It was not long, and it did not ask for forgiveness. He wrote that he had visited the factory site one evening after everyone had gone home. He said he finally understood what the place meant to me, not because of the business, but because of the spirit that lingered there. He ended with a line that I will never forget. "You built something that cannot be sold." I folded the letter and placed it inside Walter's ledger, between pages stained with sawdust and coffee. It felt like closing a circle. I realized then that love within a family is not always tender. Sometimes it is firm, like the grain of oak resisting the blade. Sometimes it requires you to protect what others cannot yet value. The years ahead were quiet ones. I spent more time in the garden, tending to the roses Walter had planted long ago. When people asked about the company, I spoke with calm pride. It continued to thrive not because of me, but because enough people believed that integrity was not outdated. The Foundation's board grew diverse and capable. They invited apprentices to the annual summit and named new scholarships after the oldest workers who had retired without fanfare. The story endured in small, steady ways, the only way that truly matters. As I grew older, I thought often about that morning when Andrew had asked for cash. It no longer hurt. It taught me something that time itself could not. That love without boundaries becomes enabling, and that wisdom sometimes means saying no with grace instead of rage. The plan I had made was never about revenge. It was about preservation of history, of purpose, of soul. On my last visit to the factory, I stood in the main hallway, where photographs of every era hung in frames, Walter and me with our first table, the first team of carpenters, and finally, a new picture of the current crew. They had hung it beside ours without being told. I traced the wood frame, smooth and solid, and whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to time itself, for giving me one last chance to set things right. When I left that day, I looked back only once. The building's lights glowed warm against the dusk, a quiet beacon of continuity. I smiled, knowing that it would still be there long after my hands could no longer touch it, not as an empire, but as a promise kept. And so, the story of my grandson who once demanded the company's sale did not end with bitterness. It ended with balance. He found his own path and I kept faith with the past. Perhaps that is all legacy truly is, not ownership but endurance. The kind that lives quietly in every act of integrity, waiting to be discovered again by those who come next. The better plan in the end was never about money. It was about peace. And I made it, not for myself but for everyone who ever believed that something built with love deserves to last.